Wow, that's quite a build-up. I hope I don't disappoint. But thank you, Ryan, for allowing me to be a part of this tremendous conference. It really is truly a pleasure to be here, and I do applaud you for staying to the bitter end, to actually just coming for the whole week and investing your lives in learning how to become a more effective ambassador for Jesus Christ. And I'm excited to share with you what I've been working on for the past couple of years, because I do think it is a natural outflowing of apologetic study. When I began studying apologetics in 2004, it was a humbling and difficult but yet wonderful process, because I came through that experience with a profound confidence in the truth of the Christian worldview. But over the years, I began to wonder. I was so convinced of the Christian worldview. It seemed so obvious to me. But for some reason, it didn't seem to be quite as obvious to other people, especially atheists. And of course, I understand that none of us seek after God, and we all have reasons for that. But I wanted to hear from them. I wanted to hear their story, their reasons for disbelief, their reasons for resistance against God, their contemptuousness for religion. And I wondered how God enabled resistant hearts and minds to turn to Him, to come to Him, to find themselves on their knees, surrendered to Christ. And those questions took me on an investigative journey that I've been on for the past couple of years. I've had the opportunity to sit down with over 50 former atheists, to hear their stories, to see the ways and means, to get a glimpse into the way that God turns resistant people towards Himself. And it's been nothing less than inspirational for me to see these radically transformed lives, these lives that have moved from darkness to light. And I hope to share some of that with you today, so that we can hopefully, again, just get a better understanding of how to use our apologetics, how to engage with those who aren't yet convinced. I'll never forget the first person that I sat down with. It was a man in a coffee house in England. And I was very curious, because on his survey he said he had become an atheist as a child. And I thought, what could have informed that? And so we sat down, and over a cup of tea, which you do in England, of course, I asked him, I said, tell me your story. And he said, Jana, he said, when I was a child, my brothers and sisters and I used to get shuffled off to church on occasion. And it was during that brief exposure that I learned that God and that Jesus loved me. He said, but something happened when I turned 7. Our house caught on fire. And he said, I ran out of the house with my little sister, and we stood there. We were unharmed, but we stood there and watched our house burn. And knowing that my little brother was inside, trapped, and he died inside of smoke inhalation. And we watched my older brother, 11 at the time, we watched him run out of the house engulfed in flames. We put him out, and we put him in the ambulance, and I sat at his feet, and we rode to the hospital, and he suffered in the hospital for 5 days, and then he died. 90% of his body burned. During that time, he said that the minister called for me to come over to pray, and he said I couldn't have anything to do with God after that. And he said I heard him talk about for the next 20 years, he was emotionally enraged against God and all things religious. Thank you. He wouldn't as much as step foot in a church for a wedding or a funeral. He would actually just sit outside and wait. He developed an arsenal of rational arguments to justify his anti-God position, and he let everyone know about it. What would it take for someone so emotionally invested, so rationally justified for 20 years? What would it take for someone like that to turn, to change? How could God do that? Well, I wanted to know the rest of his story, and I wanted to know the rest of other stories. Because you see, I think I had been missing something. I think I had been thinking about it as being fairly easy to convince someone that that it with just a little bit of rational argument and intelligence and knowledge and reason and logic, that I could bring someone to my side. But it seems like the paradigm never shifted. The atheist still called the duck a duck, and the Christian the rabbit a rabbit, and there never seemed to be kind of a switch or a meeting in the middle or a compromise, or somehow there didn't seem to be that shift. And so I started thinking about it and wondering, is there something that I'm missing? Perhaps there's something below the surface that I'm not really considering. Perhaps there's the heart. Perhaps there's the passions. And I started reading people like Blaise Pascal and really considering what's going on with our beliefs. Why do we hold the beliefs that we hold? Perhaps there's more than just rationality. Perhaps we have reasons for our reasons that aren't very rational. Perhaps we move towards the direction of things that we want rather than what's true. Pascal says it this way: people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. We all do that, right? We all rationalize things that we want. Why would it be any different, especially when it comes to the big issues of life? So I started thinking about that some more and considering, well, perhaps changing your mind is more than just changing an idea. It incorporates changing our sense of belonging, our values, our commitments, our ways of living, the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we think about our experiences and our emotions. It affects all of life. Our worldview, our way that we look at the world, the lens through which we see, it's fully orbed. It incorporates all of life. So in order to ask somebody to change their belief in God about ultimate reality, it's more than just checking a box or not about a belief. It changes your whole world. It can potentially turn your world upside down. It can be a tumultuous change. Think about what it would take for you, for someone to say, don't believe in God anymore. What would that take? That's why most people say no to religious conversion, any kind of religious conversion, according to the leading researcher in the field, Louis Markos. Resistance is the typical response for 80 to 90%. Much less for those who are moving from a starkly different worldview to another, like atheism is to Christianity. These worldviews are starkly different. They answer the big questions of life very differently. Questions about the physical universe and the physical nature of our universe. Questions about our human nature, who we are in our humanity. And that's because they have very different starting points. Atheism starts with matter and energy. Nothing exists more than the natural world. Nothing exists outside of the physical universe. It's inside of a box of determined cause and effect. Every question that has to be answered within that reality, whether it be answers with regard to the physical universe or with regard to who we are in our humanness. That we are, too, just determined cause and effect, matter in motion, no inherent dignity or value or purpose. But the theistic worldview, of course, has a very different starting point. We appreciate the reality of the physical universe, yes, that it's orderly, it's rational, it's predictable, it's testable, it undergirds the scientific method. But it is born from a transcendent creator God, personal, powerful, intelligent, who not only created but orders and sustains it and creates who we are as humans and endows us with an infinite dignity, purpose, and worth. Now, those are very different ways of looking at life, very different ways of looking at reality. And the question, of course, that stands between them is God real? Does he exist or does he not exist? The atheist would say, of course not. Nothing supernatural exists. There's nothing that exists outside of the box, outside of nature. We are sober-minded, rational, scientifically minded individuals. We have no need for that hypothesis. They would say, religion, what is that? Why do people run to religion? Because it feels good. It serves a function. It's a psychological crutch. It gives a sense of belonging. One person said, I thought it was, kind of like joining a bowling club. That it does something for you. It makes you feel good. But it has nothing to do with facts. It has nothing to do with reality of something that is actually there. There is no reality to investigate. There's no substance to spiritual reality. The only questions you can ask, one would say, as an atheist, is, does it work for you? Or perhaps, how did they form that belief, but not whether or not it is true? That's a very different issue. And that issue of truth, the truth about the reality of God, the truth that undergirds the Christian worldview, I wanted to know if truth played a part in the atheistic conversion to God or to Christianity. I wanted to know if they converted for merely functional reasons, social, psychological, or if they truly believed that God was real, substantively real, and that the Christian worldview was true and worthy of belief. So I went on that investigative journey, and I conducted a research study. It was in 2 parts. It started with an online computer survey where they went online and just ticked all the boxes. And then after they completed that, I had a one-on-one interview with them, in person if I could, but in most cases it was via Skype, because these were former atheists from all over the world in what's considered Western culture. They were a highly educated group of people. 40% or above held master's degrees or PhDs. Only one person had a high school diploma only. So these were a very bright group. This was a very bright group of individuals, not those who would be easily duped by religious superstition. They were predominantly male, 80% male, 20% female. The average age of declared atheism was in adolescence, at age 15. Probably not surprising. It's a time of coming into your own, asking questions, perhaps not finding answers. That's a problem. Perhaps not wanting to find answers because of other motives. But the average age of religious conversion was about 10 years later, in early adulthood. There was a wide variety of atheists within my study in terms of strength of atheism, I would say, that ranged all the way from an atheist, or those who just didn't believe in God but they really didn't care about it or think about it much, to 2/3 who had an expressed disbelief in God, not just merely a lack of belief, but they knew God didn't exist, and about 10% were more of the strongly anti-theistic brand. Now again, when I'm looking at their reasons for holding and changing beliefs, I wanted to look at it from a very holistic perspective, both with regard to the functional aspects of belief, those social, moral, experiential aspects, as well as the more substantive aspects of belief, the more intellectual, rational, as well as spiritual, experiential. There were a number of doors that led towards disbelief. And I'm going to go through each door individually, but just be aware, of course, that these work in tandem with one another. One of the most prominent doors that leads towards disbelief, of course, is the air that we breathe. It's the social culture in which we live. Not only are we attracted to ideas that we like, we're often attracted to believe, we accept the ideas of people that we like. So the people that we surround ourselves with, whether it's friends or family or just broader culture, we're constantly receiving messaging. And the constant message that seems to be pretty dominant in this post-Christian Western culture is that God is irrelevant. There's just simply no need for God. Why do you need God? We have everything that we need, right? And so there's a real strong sensibility even of the happy atheist. One person says it this way: I didn't have too many worldly concerns in this life. I was well on my way to being very, very happy on all fronts. I was sheltered by a family who was very loving and very nurturing. And that environment sheltered me from asking those big questions. Why should I worry about such things when life is good? It's a big slap of the face in the face of the theory that people find religion only when life is miserable. There was also a real strong sensibility of just lack of exposure to God or Christianity, that it just wasn't present in their life. Listen to this person. I grew up in a household that was not religious. There was no discussion of religion. There was no discussion of faith. They didn't say anything bad about religion, but they just never talked about it. It never came up. So I wasn't exposed in the house to anything at all about faith. And my friends, none of them were. None of their parents were religious either. I was in a world where religion and faith were just absent. It was a non-issue. So I didn't think about it a lot. And that was true for, again, more than half of those in my study had this general sense of lack. The only messaging that they were getting was from social culture, from media, from film, from television, from music, from the arts, from education. About 25% had some kind of nominal exposure, perhaps a Christmas, Easter service here and there, a brief childhood belief, perhaps. About 18% had some kind of active exposure to Protestantism or Catholicism. Even half of those never expressed any kind of belief in that. About 4 were what I would consider to be deconverted Christians. So these were a group of people who really didn't have a very strong sensibility about what Christianity is, who Christians are, that kind of thing, because they just weren't in their world, except for what they were receiving from culture, which was not always good. They had bought into the concepts of culture that God is just a merely social belief, a psychological crutch, embarrassing, irrelevant, basically untrue. And their ideas about Christians, well, that wasn't quite so positive either. For Christians, the prominent message or thought was that Christians are just clueless. One person said, who had a real lack of exposure, he said, when I thought of Christians, I thought of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, that goody-goody two-shoes neighbor that everyone loves to hate. He said it this way: I grew up thinking that religion is stupid, for the weak, that atheists are intellectually superior to believers. That's kind of where I was, mostly ignorant of religion, partly against it, and a little mystified as to why people continued to do this. Not only were Christians considered backwards intellectually, they were also considered to be backwards socially or morally, very intolerant. Again, all these negative adjectives that kept surfacing. Overall, Christians were perceived as irrational, deluded, intolerant, uneducated, superstitious, weak, needy people. And please notice, not one person had the perception that Christians were educated people. Not one. Of course, again, they're getting that messaging from social culture, from education, from certain authorities in their lives, but they're also getting that from Christians, unfortunately. Those who did seek after answers, I had several people say that I did try. I went and searched for answers, but Christians didn't seem to know how to respond. Sometimes we actually give that message literally. I drive back and forth taking my daughters to school 4 times a day. This was a sign that was posted during the time I was conducting my interviews, and I was very acutely aware of this perception of Christians as uneducated. I called the church. I said, would you please correct the spelling of atheists? we have a real PR problem, and I think it would be great if you corrected the spelling. I drove back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. They didn't change it. So my daughters and I took care of that for them. Christians also usher atheists towards disbelief by their actions. About 50% of those involved in the study said that they moved towards disbelief, or at least used this as a reason, because their perception of Christians were that they were hypocritical, that somehow they didn't live any differently than any of their other friends that they could see, if they did have some kind of association with them, or what they observed in culture. Christians seemed to live no differently. I think what was harder for me to take was the idea that 1/3 moved away from God because of a direct or personal negative encounter with a Christian. One of the most heart-wrenching stories that I heard was from someone who, when he was 15 years old, his parents had divorced, and he was in pain about that. He was angry about that. It was on his 15th birthday. He had some friends over to celebrate. His mom was in the house, had invited a guest over too, someone he called a mission field worker. He said, at some point I went to go ask my mom a question, and he found them behind closed bedroom doors, naked. And he said, that was my impression of Christianity. He said, it left a very bad taste in my mouth about Christianity. And he said, later on in his story, he said, when I was 15, same year, it's when I gave my life not to Christ. He said, I gave my life to Satan. And his life took a very downward turn after that. So the way that we live, even from a distance, it's being observed. And we're being judged on that because the way we represent God and our faith. There's another door, of course, that we've heard about this one quite a bit, is that, if God's there, why do I have so much pain in my life? Why is there so much evil in the world? And that's certainly a reason that was given, particularly personal pain and suffering, ushered some people out the door, about 16%. Just like the young man at the beginning, very emotionally grounded atheism. Sometimes it's a tragic event like that, a death, a disappointment. Sometimes it's a prolonged experience. Listen to this young man's story. He said, if there was a God who loved us, then I wouldn't feel the way that I felt. I wouldn't go through what I was going through, because if God was real, things wouldn't work like this. I wouldn't have an alcoholic father. I wouldn't go through the stuff that you go through with an alcoholic parent. In my story, there was sexual abuse. That, to me, once that happened, life got very dark for me. And he goes on to talk about the pain and anger that he had pent up inside. And he said, I found an outlet for my anger, and it was the wrestling mat. But he said, every boy my age, I would pin in 10 seconds flat. So they started matching him and pairing him with older and stronger young men. He said, to the point where I really got outmatched. And I found myself on the wrestling mat with my neck broken in 4 places. And that was at a point where his life started to turn. And we'll talk about that later. But of course, this sensation or this sensibility that God is just absent ushers people out the door. Now, I must say, if any of you are familiar with Paul Witt's writings on faith of the fatherless, about the thesis that if someone has a weak, abusive, or absent, emotionally or physically abusive, weak, absent father, that can promote atheism. It does, and it can. And I had a few stories like that, this one being included. But please be careful not to overgeneralize. Again, it was a part of my research. It appeared from at least this small group that about the same number, the same percentage, about 16%, said they had a troubled relationship with one or both parents. So that can be an influence, but it's not for all. Remember, the young, happy atheist at the beginning had a very nurturing family. Of course, the moral door is one we hear of a lot. People like to leave God because they don't like to be told what to do. No one wants a moral dictator, right? And if there's no God, you can stop worrying and enjoy your life, a la Richard Dawkins. And it's an easy way to go. Some people actually have a tendency when they get older to want to loosen the authorities in their lives. This young man went to college and decided to move towards atheism. He said, "I think for a while the attractiveness of atheism was defined by it not being Christianity. It was attractive to think I was not going to be judged. It was attractive to think I could sleep with anyone I wanted or use whatever language I wanted, make any decision I want. I wanted this God stuff to be false. I had lived under my parents' authority so much of my life. I'm a free man now, and I don't want a cosmic authority, please. You figure out that all this God stuff is not true so naturally as you would do with anything else that's rubbish. You throw it away because you don't need it, and you can breathe a sigh of relief and do what you want." He kind of summed himself up, and he said, I had sincere doubts and insincere motives. And that was a lethal combination for him. It would just usher the door for him to exit anything to do with God. Of course, there's another, and just again, because oftentimes we paint all atheists, they just want to live in this sexually, free, and sexual freedom and moral autonomy and all of that. In self-reflecting, only 43% said that was a contributor to their atheism. It is a strong component, but it's not true of all. We all do suppress the truth of God and righteousness at some level, but for many it's not that kind of blatant sexual immorality that we might paint. So we need to be very careful about that. Of course, the intellectual door is the door that we as apologists hear about the most, right? It's the smart thing to do, to be an atheist. If you want to be considered bright, intellectually respectable, that's the direction that you go. Particularly if you are an advocate of science or anything to do with the hard sciences. One person said it this way: I think part of it came from my background in education and science. I took a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and had always been an avid science enthusiast growing up. As a teenager, I read all of Carl Sagan's books. I was an amateur astronomer, and science for me was the only answer for how you want to understand anything in the world. So that definitely fed into the contemptuousness, because I think I regarded religious people who were religious as they just don't understand science. They can't appreciate science. Either they're ignorant or stupid, or things like that, I think. I was a champion of the scientific worldview, and religious people were just undereducated, I guess. So again, there's a very strong perception that the messaging here is God is dead. God is dead and science is alive. Science is king. And that we learn and grow and understand reality, and we get true knowledge through objective scientific method and facts, not fiction, not religious fiction born on blind faith. That's the message. There's also another prominent messaging that you can't believe in God and have appreciation for science at the same time. Here's science, science wins, that's it. That's a very strong component in the intellectual community. They also the Brights have another message, that God is a delusion, a Freudian wish fulfillment to meet our infantile needs. About 3/4 thought at the time they were atheists that Christians are deluded people. Genuinely deluded. One person said it this way: I thought you were just deluding yourselves. It was, I don't want to say it was a harmful delusion, but it was just like, why don't you just deal with reality the way that it is? Why are you kidding yourself with all this nonsense, all these miracles and all this stuff? Obviously, we don't see any of that stuff. Of course, you can hear the naturalistic worldview coming through there. Again, they think of Christians as just building this God like you would construct a Mr. Potato Head to meet your needs. One person said God was more of a Santa Claus figure. He was someone they looked to solve their problems, to give them things that they wanted, also to tell them what to do, what rules to follow. Another message coming from the intellectual door is that God is dangerous, particularly since 9/11, right? And considering what's going on in the state of the world, the affairs of the world today, with people killing in the name of God, oftentimes, even though it may be from one particular religious group, they throw Christianity in there with it. They don't oftentimes make a savvy distinction between them. One person said, it's harmful than anything else. Religion is harmful because it convinces large groups of people to do really stupid things and act inhumanely or unethically or immorally, and it's all those stories you hear about. And it reminds me, and keep in mind at this point, I was putting Christianity in the bucket with all other religions. And I think that's more common than we know. So think about all these messages coming together. That belief in God is dangerous, it's a delusion, it's non-scientific, it's for the uneducated, for the stupid, for the intolerant. All of these negative adjectives. Think about what would happen in the mind of someone who has no exposure to Christianity, to substantive Christian thought. Well, it loses plausibility, right? And Peter Berger says if religion loses plausibility, then it just can be dismissed out of hand. It loses its place to have a seat at the table in the marketplace of ideas. It's just dismissed. One person said, I remember thinking that atheism was a mature perspective for strong adults, and religion was for weak children and old ladies. And listen to this sobered analysis of religion. For a big part of the population, particularly the cultural elites, religion is regarded as like pornography. It is a horrible, dirty, disgusting thing that we allow people to do because we live in a free society. But it should be kept in a paper bag where people don't have to see it or be affronted by it. The idea is, okay, if you want to be religious, fine, go. Be religious in some little cave where we can't see you, and please die off so we don't have to deal with this problem again, because when you think that way, before you even speak anything, you've already dismissed them. Do you get that? What happens to apologetics, to the rational argument, when you've been dismissed before you're even granted a hearing? Another person says this, there is such a culture of atheism is obviously correct, that it leads to quite an uncharitable interpretation of things that come across your path. Like, if you encounter an argument for God, you just presume it's going to be nonsense, like, these stupid theists, God bless them, trying to use logic. What happens? What happens to all this hard work that we're doing about apologetics, right? If it's not granted a place at the table. It's a problem. That's why nearly 2/3 said that no amount of evidence would convince them otherwise, because they truly believed that Christianity was not true, nor was it good. And nothing could convince them otherwise. You're talking about a highly resistant group of people who don't even want to give it a hearing. What then? These were people who became Christians, believe it or not. How did that happen? 68%, again about 2/3, said they were not actively seeking. They were closed off. Only 16% admitted some degree of active seeking, questioning towards God. How then did these people move, these resistant people move from a place where they were moderately confident in their atheism to a place post-conversion that they were highly confident in the reality of God? Don't you want to know? That's the million-dollar question. I mean, only the work of God can accomplish something like this in the hearts and minds of resistant people. So we're going to talk about that. I want to turn the page a little bit and talk about how God worked in the lives of these resistant people to bring them to himself. Now, I do want to say first that just because someone might be willing to look outside the naturalistic atheistic worldview, outside the box, they're not going to automatically run to God, the Judeo-Christian God. In fact, many will run anywhere but the Judeo-Christian God, anywhere but that. They'll move towards generic faiths, socially acceptable Eastern faiths, not that aren't terribly morally accountable in nature. Some will even move towards dark spirituality. There was one young man. He was in a place where he was honest enough to say, I was really dead inside. I was numb. I just didn't experience anything in the world anymore. Nothing made a difference to me. He was drug addicted. He said, I reached a point, if I continued in my lifestyle, that I knew I was going to kill myself just through his lifestyle. He said, I reached a point where I was willing to reconsider my atheism and think about something else. He said, I called out to Satan to prove himself. If he's real, prove himself. And I called out to God, if you're real, prove yourself. And he actually had encounters with both. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there are some doors that lead back towards belief, or towards belief even for the first time. But they're not front doors. They're usually not front doors of rational argument. They're usually back doors into which atheists encounter Christians, that break down the stereotype, that give them another picture, that give them a different kind of life to observe, to question, to be curious about. Sometimes they are really not looking, but someone they meet makes them move in another direction. Remember that very, very happy atheist who was happy on all fronts? He said, God knew that the only way he could turn my head in his direction was to turn my head with a beautiful woman. And he did. He met this gorgeous woman, American woman, on vacation. He said, I wanted to know what she believed and why she believed it, and his motives, he said, were not pure. Okay? He wanted her not to believe. He said, but I was open enough to try to figure it out. He said, I stepped inside a church building. He was on his own. He said, I stepped inside a church building. He anticipated looking at Christians, he said, like you would look at exotic zoo animals in a zoo. He said, but when I entered the doors, he said, I found something very different. He said, I found sincere people who were prayerful, who were worshipful, who were friendly, who were nice, who were normal. And he said, I sat through the service. When the service ended, he said, I couldn't wait to escape. He said, I was so embarrassed to be inside. I would have been totally ashamed if anyone knew that I was even in there, he said. I got to the back door. I wanted to get out before anybody said anything to me at all. He said, I started to open the back door, and he said, I experienced this, he described it, it's hard to know, kind of a spiritual rush. He said, it made me stop in my step. He said, it made me think, why am I here? I need to find out whether or not this is true. And he said he turned around and walked straight up to the pastor and said, so you believe God exists? Can we talk about this? And that started a series of discussions. He now has multiple advanced degrees in theology. No longer the girlfriend, though. But there are other unsuspecting encounters that you're not really looking for it, you're not really seeking to find out. There was a history teacher. He taught in a high school. There was another teacher in the school, a Christian teacher, who taught science. And he said, I had observed him from a distance. I really didn't want to get to know him. He said, but they were put together essentially on a field trip. He said, I approached any bus, and I got on the bus, and he said the only seat left was by this guy, David. He said, after initial pleasantries, I had to ask him. He said, I know you're a Christian. How can that be? How can you be a Christian and a science teacher? This was a transformative conversation, he says. This was the change. This was the first time I had met a Christian who was intelligent, or seemingly intelligent, who could answer some of the questions I had. And what was different about him? He's a very humble sort of character, and that was disarming. So I was prepared to get into a real fight, into an argument, and he wasn't that type. And I found that this whole experience was quite strange, because I had spent an hour talking to him, and I realized he's a really nice person, and I enjoyed having this conversation. And he made me think about some things I really had not thought about before. He certainly didn't convert me in that conversation, but what he did was to break down some barriers for me. It was an eye-opener. And they went on to have more conversations at the impetus of the atheist. He had questions he wanted answers to, and they met for about 3 months, and he gave his life to Christ, and now he's looking for a way to go to seminary. About 20% said that they pursued or became a little bit more softened, more open because of a significant relationship in their life. Only 6% said they really pursued for some kind of social belonging, that functional reason. But the most significant, I think, statistic, one of the most significant findings in my study is that 82% thought that some kind of social interaction with a Christian is what softened them towards looking, towards wondering, towards being curious about Christianity. There's another back door. Again, these aren't front doors, these are back doors, because these are a bit unsuspected. They're not sought out. Some atheists, particularly those who have pain and anger associated with their atheism, often find themselves softened through emotion and experience, particularly at the hands of a Christian. Remember the young man who broke his neck on the wrestling match? He found himself in a hospital bed with one of those halos drilled into his skull to stabilize his spine. He said, day after day, a nurse named Dolores used to come into my room. She would take care of me, yes, but every day she would ask, "Can I pray for you?" And he would say, "No, I don't believe that stuff." And he said she would grab my hand and say a prayer. And then she would say, "Can I read the Bible to you?" And he would say, "No, I don't believe that stuff." And every day she would read scripture to him. And she said she wasn't obnoxious or pushy, but it was her manner that allowed her to do that. And he could tell over time that she really cared for him. And there was a body of believers, a church that seemed to rally around this family that didn't go to church there, to minister to them, to bring them meals during this time of need. And he said, when I got out, we went to this church, and a youth minister started investing in me personally, started coming to my sports activities, started investing in my life to the point where I felt like he was the father that I didn't have, that he loved me in an appropriate way, and it turned him towards God and towards Christ. And that pent-up anger that he once had, that turned into enthusiasm, and he ended up coming to Christ after some investigation because he wanted to make sure what he was believing was true. But he ended up starting FCA in his high school that very year. So sometimes the love of God through his people can turn a soul back to God. Sometimes, though, it's just the weariness of living out the atheistic life. Because, like we said at the beginning, there is no inherent value, dignity, purpose within the atheistic worldview. They cannot ground that. And sometimes that takes its toll. Listen to one person's story. Prior to my actual conversion in 2010, it was a combination of being around Christians, getting a little bit older into your 30s, and starting to perceive your mortality a little bit. You're realizing the fear of nothingness, of emptiness, of meaninglessness. It was a huge driver. Just thinking, why go through all the struggle, the grind, working so hard to achieve things that will just vanish away? You're just going to die. It felt like building a sandcastle along the beach at low tide, knowing that the tide is going to come in and wipe it out. That was a huge driver, the search for meaning. It really made me a lot more open to listen. I had to ask myself, am I willing to consider another point of view and that mine had nothing to offer? I didn't delight in the intellectual superiority of it anymore. I think just reflecting on the futility of life as an atheist was something that really laid the groundwork for me to investigate something else. So sometimes it's just patience and time and people being willing to self-reflect. And sometimes we can help them with that, right? But sometimes we have to be very patient in the process. There's another door, again, the mass door through which many people exited, the moral door. Sometimes people actually come back through and towards God through the door of morality. Again, letting time take its toll and seeing how a life is led through moral freedom and moral relativism and really what can result. Listen to this one. At first it was fantastic. I could do whatever I wanted and there was no one to judge your behavior. I could write my own moral blank check. And it wasn't anything I saw a problem behind until years later, descending into lower and lower levels of depravity. Just, things I did to people, ways I betrayed people, things I gave myself license to do that were really horrific in a lot of ways. It was only after a history of this and the self-reflection of where this is taking me. There's no bottom to it. You can just go on and on forever in terms of creating your own morality. You can excuse anything you want if you have a mind to do it. And so I just started reflecting on, what am I doing? Who am I becoming? Even as an atheist, I still recognize these things were not inherently right. And even though I could justify it on an ad hoc basis, which I did for years, it had become too much to bear on my conscience after a number of years of this. Again, as we all know, it's hard to escape that sense of moral oughtness since the moral law is written on our hearts. And some actually felt compelled to move towards God because they knew that to be true. They found themselves to be very moral atheists. And that troubled them, that they couldn't ground it. And so some of them actually took a very strong intellectual journey because of that issue. But it was, to me, one of the most amazing things that I heard over and again for those were when they actually came to a point of recognition and belief that there had to be a transcendent moral lawgiver, that person was a personal God to whom they were accountable. And they felt this strong sense of moral culpability. It was a very strong experience for many of them when they put those two together. So our human experience can sometimes lead us to the point, or lead atheists to the point where they're willing to look outside the box because of the limiting nature of the naturalistic worldview, and because in our basic humanity, our human need for value, for dignity, for meaning, for purpose, for knowing that there is good and bad, that sometimes it will lead to a sense that awareness leads to discontent and doubt. And they can start thinking about and realizing the dehumanizing nature of their own worldview, the implications of their own belief system, and so that they're willing to look beyond. And some do. And they start asking the questions, does it work? Does it work? And really, we know from worldviews that the only place it works is in the person of God, right? And so they're willing to move that direction. Another place, of course, is the person of God, and these, what I'm calling religious experiences. 37 to 45% expressed some kind of religious experience that they encountered moved them in the conversion process. Now, what does that mean? It can mean a lot of things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Some people, believe it or not, encountered a religious experience just by reading the Bible. I think sometimes we get so accustomed to it. It's so, part of who we are, and we're in the Word all the time, that we forget sometimes how powerful it can be for those who enter for the first time and engage it, even reluctantly, even to disprove it. Sometimes people resistant find something other than what they expected. There was a couple. They lost twins prematurely. And he said, my wife became more open to God. And so we went to church. And the pastor asked me to read the first 3 chapters of the book of John. He said, I didn't want to even touch the book, much less read it. He said, but I'm a man of my word. So I opened it up. He said, I started reading the book of John. I couldn't stop. He read the book of John within 1 week. But there were several stories of that kind of voracious appetite once someone got into it and saw that there was so much more than the negative stereotypes that they had heard about, that it's written by a moral monster. It's just horrible and corrupt and antiquated and misogynistic, or whatever it is the stereotype is. They get in and find something so totally different than what they expect, especially in the person and the words of Jesus. Listen to this person as he opened the Bible. He said, the first time, he said, I remember reading the Bible for the first time. I read the Gospel of Matthew, and I remember Jesus' words. I didn't just read them. They were alive. Even now as I'm talking about it, I remember the time very distinctly, because it was like, I felt like I could see for the first time. And he began speaking to me just through his word. I remember hearing his voice when I read the book. I had never heard anyone speak like this. I had read books before, but I had never felt like the words were coming off the page, and they were. And again, the person of Jesus he's compelling. I mean, I heard so many descriptors that were so unexpected. He's so majestic. He could throw down with the Pharisees. He's so strong. Things so other than what they thought, this meek, mild person on the wall that they had perhaps seen in their childhood. Listen to this person. He said that he had had some kind of religious experience. I said, what was that? He said, it wasn't like a vision or anything like that, but I was really feeling so strongly drawn to the character of Jesus, strongly, supernaturally, powerfully attracted to the person of Jesus. And the spiritual experiences when I would read or think anything about Jesus, I just remember reading the Bible and literally shaking when I read the Gospels, because I just could not believe that there was a person like this, and this person was God, and that this person cared for me. And even though I wasn't necessarily willing to jump in full bore at this point, that was the draw in my heart that I felt needed an answer. I think sometimes, believe it or not, we just need to get them to open the Word. And God does His work, and it's so powerful. Sometimes people are willing to open up and say, at some point, God, if you're there, if you're real, would you just show me? And God showed up in many circumstances, either through providential circumstances or perhaps a dramatic encounter. One providential circumstance was, do you remember the young man who had given his life to Satan and his life had taken a downward spiral? He ended up in Texas, drug addicted, homeless, had been kicked out of his own home because of his reckless behavior. He came kind of to the end of himself one night. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, I called my sister. I called home. I said, I want to come home. And she said, well, I don't know. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. We need to talk with Mom about this. I'll get back with you. He said, I hung up the phone with my sister. And he said, I didn't believe in God at that point. But he said, I said a prayer. And this was his prayer. He said, God, if you're real, I need your help. I need out of this. I was 22 at the time. And so his sister called back at 8 o'clock in the morning and said, Mom said you can come home. We don't know how we're going to get you home, but don't worry, hang on. We'll do it somehow. He said, no, I had not even hung up the phone, or as soon as I hung up the phone with her, the phone rang again. He hadn't even taken his hand off the phone. The phone rang. And he said, this time it was my cousin. I was in Dallas, and it was my cousin from Kansas City who just happens to be driving to Dallas for 3 days and wants to see me. And I was like, God is real. It blew me away. Okay, so that encounter, in a sense, opened him up to the possibility, again, that God exists. Now, he wasn't converted at that moment. There were incredible circumstances that happened on in his journey that caused him to believe in the reality of God. He now leads apologetics Bible studies with Bill Craig's material. So it's amazing that God shows up in extraordinary, very unique and personal ways when someone is calling out, when someone is seeking. Now, there are these encounters that I heard, dreams, visions, personal encounters, much like you would hear when you hear about near-death experiences. They were vivid in nature, highly descriptive, highly memorable, something other than, something extraordinary, more than a regular dream. The man who called out for God if he's real and Satan if he's real, he said, you know, I was kind of homeless, and I happened on my cousin's doorstep, and she kind of let me stay in her basement, and it was dark and black and all this. And he said, there was one day I said, I felt the burden to talk to my cousin, like she needs to tell me something. And so his cousin started talking with him and started talking with him about Jesus. And then he said, and at this time, the room filled with light. And it was just like an amazing kind of light. It was a light that I had never seen before, and the light was alive, and the light had power. The light was full of love. It was the most wonderful thing to see. And as I was feeling this, I felt so sinful. If there was a trap door that just opened directly to hell, it would have been 100% justified. It would be totally right. But just as I was feeling this extreme sin, at the same time and at the same moment, this light came and spoke to me. I didn't see the form, but I heard the voice audibly, and it said, I forgive you. And he's reflecting 42 years later, I still cry when I think about it. And then he said, when I heard that, I just collapsed. I fell on the floor and I was bawling my eyes out, you forgive me? And then I understood what love and salvation were all about. I understood that Jesus was fully perfect and that he was 100% truth. And I didn't know how to say, Jesus, come into my heart. I just knew I was giving him my heart. And when I came out of it, I looked at my cousin, and I was totally biblically illiterate. And I said, I feel like I'm a baby. I'm a completely different person, and I'm going to live the rest of my life for Jesus Christ because I know he is the truth. So that's what I've been trying to do since. And he has. He's been a missionary for 42 years. Now, he did have a second encounter the same week with Satan. It was just as vivid, if not more so, highly descriptive. It gave him a palpable sensibility about the darkness and reality of hell, and gave him a heart for those who were going there. So that fueled his fire to move back into darkness and bring light to those who don't have it. So those encounters are real. We often think of them in the Muslim world and the unreached people groups, but atheists are, in a sense, an unreached people group. And God shows up in extraordinary ways there as well. It's amazing. Now, experiences, though, are experiences. They are transient in nature. And even for the atheist, they understand that. They know it's subjective. For them, it can be utterly convincing that God is real. But they know that it may not be convincing for others. And they want to have more than that. And they actually, some of them want to be convinced on a rational level as well, because they are rational beings. In fact, one of them went to a neurologist after an encounter because he had felt some kind of electrical activity in his body along with some other things. He thought, I need to have my brain tested. I mean, these are rational people. They need some explanation. One person called the Richard Dawkins Institute to try to figure out, have them explain what happened to him. But they know that it is transient and it is subjective, particularly for other people. So a lot of atheists are hesitant to even speak of it, particularly to other atheists, because it will just be dismissed out of hand. Most of them, when they enter, whether it's through, when they become open and they come even partially convinced of God, they will want to have some substantive, rational explanation for what's going on. Sometimes it's not on the back of an experience. Sometimes it's just looking again at the implications, the ends of their own worldview, the atheistic worldview, and saying, okay, what about the origin of the universe? What about this exquisite, fine-tuned universe? What about the moral law? And they don't feel that they're getting substantive answers within their own worldview. And so that fosters some kind of dissatisfaction and willingness to look outside of the box. And so they start asking questions. Is it true? Is atheism true? Is there something outside the box that's true? Doubt fosters searching. Sometimes just in an effort to disprove Christianity or religion, some people will actually intentionally start searching in more of an intellectual, rational fashion. For some, belief in Christianity is committing intellectual suicide. And when they find and discover that that doesn't have to happen, it spurs them on to amazing amount of study. Remember the young man who loved his morality in college? He was a big follower of Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins says to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so he said, I took that to heart. And I wanted to see him respond to some of the things that the Christians were raising. And he wasn't responding. And he said, it actually led me to William Lane Craig, because Richard Dawkins wouldn't debate William Lane Craig. So I wanted to know what William Lane Craig believed. And so it opened a door of the profundity of Christian thought and worldview that we have available to us. And he said, I eventually became intellectually convinced that Christianity was true, but I wasn't yet ready to believe. And for many of them, that is the case. There will be an intellectual kind of belief, but it takes a while because of the fully orbed nature of conversion before they are willing to give their heart and their life to Christ. There was another young man, I believe probably a genius if you tested him, brilliant off the charts, I would imagine. By the time he was 14, he said, I had read all the French existentialists. I was a true nihilist. He said, I could run circles around anybody, any religious person, any street preacher, anybody who called himself a Christian. He said, I had an argument for him. I could just completely take him under. One day, he went to a writers' club meeting. He met a young lady whose father happened to be a PhD philosopher who had trained in Germany at the same place of study that Bill Craig had gotten his PhD in theology at the same time. He said, I finally found someone with whom I could intellectually spar. He was not, I guess he had a fairly high sense of self as an atheist. He said, I had found my intellectual equal. And so, or at least someone who understood philosophy the way that he did. He said, so could you meet with me, on a weekly basis and we can talk about the philosophers? And he said, sure. This Christian man said, sure. And they met every week for at least a year. He said, this man didn't first bring the Christian worldview and try to convince me. He said, we looked at the philosophers. We looked at many areas of thought. He said, he allowed me to come to a place of where I was willing to investigate it and see the weaknesses of my own understanding about reality. It was enough for him to be open enough to at least look at other religious worldviews in order to disprove them. So that was the next step. So he decided he was going to spend the summer disproving religious worldviews. It was during this time that his mother went to a cigar shop to buy a cigar for his dad. And the cigar shop owner, I guess, had an apologetics or Bible study called Holy Smokes. But anyway, on the counter in this shop, there was a book by Lee Strobel, Case for Christ. And his mom questioned about it, and he said, "Oh, if you want that, take it with you." She brought it home, thinking that her son might be interested. Listen to his paradigm shift. And so I got home while I was processing all of these questions, and the book, was sitting on our counter by our telephone. And I thought, what is this? And so I devoured it in a weekend. I was debating the book. I had my legal pad. I was reading his arguments and countering his arguments as a debater would. And he was, and this is something I appreciate about excellent apologetics, is that he was predictive of counter-arguments. And it made me so angry. Here is this guy who wasn't even in the room, and he was able to, it was like playing chess with someone who was really good, and it was very infuriating. And I remember that was the first time I thought, wait a minute. There is a whole world, a whole universe of Christian thinking below the surface here I had absolutely no idea about. That was when I discovered how ignorant my concepts of it were. That's when I started to dive deep into, Lee Strobel, led very quickly to William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, actually sitting down to read Augustine and just thinking, I am such a fool for thinking, like a punk attitude at 15 or 16 years old, because I'm angry. I can throw all of this ton of literature that people have been thinking about, these profoundly important questions, like, who am I? Like, I am arrogant, but I'm not that arrogant. And so there was this shift, subtly, from I'm going to disprove Christianity to saying, I want to know if it is actually true. And so that was of fundamental importance. You get this commitment to truth. And I want to know what reality actually is. Really, that process, it took 18 months or so of painstaking research. And I always say, I became a Christian kicking and screaming. He's now a pastor in a church. And just in case you're interested, the 5 most compelling rational evidences they found towards belief in God. First was the resurrection, the historical person and resurrection of Jesus. If Dr. Habermas would say, he were here, I would say, that's evidence for your evidentialism. He was talking about that. And then it moves to evidences for God, the cosmological argument and the moral argument, and then to truth, beauty, and goodness. And some just merely said rational arguments were not convincing. But here's what I want you to see, that when we think about the doors that open hearts and minds to God, the catalyst oftentimes is not rational. Oftentimes it is functional in nature. That means social interaction. That means experience of a Christian, the love of a Christian, the observing of a life that's well lived, the coming to the end of themselves morally, existentially, that opens them towards the rational argument, towards substantive belief. Now, there are those, like this young man, who do pursue a very rational journey, a very intellectual journey, and then God met him in very experiential ways later on. But see the transition. So while the door opens towards God in a functional way, oftentimes, once they enter the room to investigate, it has to move in that direction, where facts and substance of belief become critically important. But oftentimes it's in combination with the other more human existential components as well. So it's a more fully orbed combination of things, because we're not just brains on sticks, right? We're people. And that we are motivated and moved in different ways. But 96% at the end of the day required some kind of substantive convincing experientially, through rationality, through evidence and that kind of thing, to come to a secured knowledge of Christ. Now, again, nobody is completely sure, and this is atypical, I would say, for people perhaps that aren't as rationally oriented. But for this group of people, they wanted to know that they weren't being deceived. They didn't want to be self-deceived. They didn't want to be duped by superstition. A lot of them came to belief at great cost. But when they came, their lives were never the same. They truly moved from darkness to light. They were dramatically transformed. When I talk about the outcome of these lives, that one's, a minister and another one's, holds advanced degrees, I wasn't picking and choosing. That was the norm. These are not nominal Christians. They are movers and shakers in the kingdom. They understand what it's like to live in darkness and what it's like to find the light of Christ. And it's truly motivating for them. So they take the light back into the darkness. A great intention. Now, of course, I wanted to ask them, what do you think that how can we as Christians best engage with those who aren't convinced? And one of the primary messages I heard from them is to make contact, break stereotypes. Break the stereotypes that are out there in culture. Destroy speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We have a huge PR problem, right? We're perceived in a very negative light. How can we counter that? Blaise Pascal says, make Christianity plausible. Make it credible. Make it full of integrity, both intellectually and in our lives. Make it attractive. Make it worth looking at a second time, or perhaps even a first time. He says, if we move towards things that we want, that we desire, that we find attractive, then make Christianity attractive. Make good men wish it was true, and then show them that it is. Make it attractive and plausible by the way that we live, living in a fully orbed sensibility about our own walk with Christ, that it's fully orbed not only in what we profess, but how we live, and that we're exhibiting joy and peace and the fruit of the Spirit, and that we're making it attractive, and that we love other people. Be the Dolores. Be the one who is generous and unselfish. Again, to help people take a second look. Don't give them excuses to leave God behind because of the way that you act, or because of the way that you live no differently from the world. It's only when we get this component right, oftentimes, where someone will even grant you a hearing, where you will be granted a seat at the table, to even be heard. And when you're heard, you need to be able to have some answers. Be David. Be the one that when that opportunity at the empty seat right next to you, and someone comes and you have an answer, you can talk about the reconcilability of science and faith, and you do it in humility and with gentleness and respect, in a way that someone wants to come back and have that conversation again. And just as we don't want to be stereotyped as Ned Flanders or the Westboro Baptist or whomever they perceive us to be, we shouldn't stereotype the atheist either. Everyone is different. Not everyone's like Richard Dawkins. We should presume nothing. One person said it this way: it's too easy to view people as nothing more than a collective set of arguments that must be defeated, instead of another human being who is deeply longing to understand their worldview just like we are. And when I asked them, again, how should we approach the atheist, they would often say it depends. And the only way you can know how to approach someone is by getting to know them, by making contact, by being salt and light. That we first must seek to understand and then to be understood. Francis Schaeffer said, if I have 1 hour with someone, I will first ask questions to see what is troubling their heart and their mind. And then the last 5 minutes, I'll give them something of the truth. We need to seek to understand and ask questions, yes. Ask those good tactical questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? If the only playing ground they'll play on is the rational playing ground, play there. Ask good questions. But get to know them. Help them feel valued. Listen to them so that they begin to trust you, so that you can start looking beneath the surface, so that you can start asking questions about their family, about growing up, about what did they think about God, what are their objections, what are hurts and pains in their lives, why, did they make the choices that they make. Ask good questions. And Lord willing, we'll see, personally, each of us will see atheists convert. We'll see them move from darkness to light to bridge that seemingly breachless gap. We'll build trust with them through forming relationship. We'll give them a reason to respect us as we are respecting them. We'll have a lot of patience. About half of those in my study said it was a very long and gradual process. The other half said it was a little bit more sudden. Once I came into the treasure trove of Christianity that I didn't know existed, it came more suddenly than that. But most of all, we need to be covered in prayer, covering them in prayer, praying about everything, because at the beginning, at the end of the day, this is God's work. Only God can change a heart and a mind, and we trust in that because this really is a miraculous work of God. And hopefully, we can move someone from curiosity, and God will see them through to conversion. Just like the young man at the beginning of my talk. Remember the young man whose house burned down, developed serious problems with God over a 20-year period? What did it take for him to change, to move? Well, here's the rest of his story. When he was 26 years old, he said, I had gone on a business trip to Japan for 4 months. While I was away, my wife became a Christian. That's an interesting story in and of itself, because she was an agnostic. He said, I came back home. When I found that out, he said, it caused an amazing amount of contempt and trouble in our marriage. He was not happy. One night, he said, she asked me to come pick her up because she was over at a friend's house. He said, I got off work. I was on the midnight shift. Got off. I went to these people's house. This was the couple that had led her to Christ. And in his words, he said, I approached for a fight. He said, I was absolutely seething. But what happened, he said, disarmed me. He said, I walked in. They asked me to come, to sit down and have a cup of tea. This is England. But it's after midnight, and these people wanted to sit down and warmly welcome him. He said, we just talked for about 2 or 3 hours. They didn't bring up God. They didn't bring up Christianity or religion. He said, because they knew it was a hot spot for me. He said, I left that evening disarmed. He said, that's not what I expected. Instead of being angry, he said, I left that feeling more valued than I ever had sitting down across the table from some other people. He said he was so attracted to that, he wanted to go back. So he said, we went back every day. And he said, we just kept talking. They didn't bring anything up about God, and I didn't either until about 6 weeks in. And then he said, I started airing my problems with God, my rational arguments, my emotional resistance. He said that went on almost every day for about 6 more months. He said, I came to the end of that. He said, now, this couple, they were knowledgeable. They were patient. They were gentle with me. They let me be. He said, at the end of 6 months, and I didn't have anything left, then the man said, so what are you holding against God? He said, can I pray for you? And he said, I just sat there. And he said, okay. Now, I'm going to pray for you. He was from a charismatic background. He said, I may say some things that you don't understand, but don't worry, it's okay. So he prayed over him. He said, and after that prayer, I felt this peace that just washed over me that I had never known. And I went home, and I got up the next morning expecting to feel just as angry as I had every other day of my life. And he said, but that peace remained. He said, I called my friend, and I said, what did you pray for? And he said, I prayed that you would have peace. And he said, I knew then that I would never be the same. Within a year, he was in seminary, and that actually broke up his marriage. But he went on to pursue God with his whole heart and with his whole life, and he's been serving as a community pastor, not a pulpit pastor, but a community pastor in his little village in England. And he says, all I do is I go around the community, and if somebody needs help, I help them. If somebody needs served, I've served them. If somebody's wounds need binding, I bind them. If somebody just needs presence, I'm there. If somebody needs an answer, a rational, intelligent answer, I'm there. And his life is full, and he has never been the same. He is truly transformed from darkness to light. You know, atheistic conversion to Christianity, it seems rare, but it's more common than you know. God is in the business of taking resistant hearts and drawing resistant people to himself and transforming them in extraordinary ways. And that gives us hope that there is a place, there is a possibility for those whom we know, and that we love, that there is a possibility of them too coming to the feet of Jesus. No one is too far from the Father's reach. Thank you for being so incredibly patient with me today. Thank you.